Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. And I'm your host, Mike Allen. You've undoubtedly heard the phrase, alms for the poor. Well, alms was money or food given to poor people over the years, handed out primarily as charity. Well, after that, the establishment of poor houses took over. Now, while they're finally extinct in Connecticut, there was a time when virtually every town in this state had one, and our guest today is an expert on the subject. Michael Westerfield is the former director of the Windham, Connecticut Housing Authority. He's also the author of the book, The Road to the Poorhouse. His book covers the era of poorhouses in the state, and it also takes a look at how Connecticut's tried to help physically and mentally handicapped persons over the years. And it's not always pretty. Michael's going to be along in just a moment with this story. This week's trivia question: what activity in an eastern Connecticut town in the early 1800s caused angry mobs to besiege a beautiful school building? Stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you'll know the topic for next week's show. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is brought to you by our sponsor, Yale New Haven Health. Yale New Haven Hospital was the very first hospital in Connecticut. They opened their doors 200 years ago and later introduced the entire country to the use of penicillin and chemotherapy. Today, some of the brightest minds in medicine choose to work there, and it's the primary teaching hospital for the prestigious Yale School of Medicine. For more information, log on to ynhhs.org. That's ynhhs.org. The poorhouse. For some people, it's something of a mythical concept, not really real, not something that existed, but a term that folks used to use to describe when somebody was down on their luck or had ran out of cash. They went to the poorhouse. Well, alas, poorhouses were really a thing, and they were around for more than 100 years in Connecticut before closing for good in the 1990s. And wait until you hear where that last one was. Now, as you'll hear, caring for the poor is something that thankfully society has done for centuries upon centuries, but the way we've gone about it has changed quite a bit. Now, in Connecticut, the system was inherited from England, as so many things were, and that's where our story will begin. And it morphed from services provided at the town level to the state level to the federal level with Uncle Sam, and now back to the state. The way we take care of people we used to call paupers and the way we care for physically and mentally handicapped individuals has changed radically. We're going to talk about all these topics today in the episode, but the primary focus will be on poorhouses. Our guest, an expert on the subject. He's literally written the book, The Road to the Poorhouse. Michael Westerfield used to be the director of the Windham, Connecticut Housing Authority, and what he learned about his own town's poorhouse during those years drove him to compile his excellent book. Michael, one of the things that I found fascinating after reading your book, The Road to the Poorhouse, was how we as a society for centuries have tried to come to grips with the less fortunate and the needy amongst us, and we've tried so many different things over the years. So we have a lot to talk about here, a lot to unpack, but if you don't mind, let's start off at the beginning with Henry VIII, and you have to go way back to then. And, of course, he had a very storied and well-known incident with the Roman Catholic Church where he parted from them and started the Anglican Church so that he could get divorced, so he could marry again. Can you tell us that part of the story?
Right. Around 1530, King Henry VIII, in his battle with the Catholic Church, decided to dissolve the monasteries and other major religious institutions in England. And these institutions had been providing all of the services to the poor. Suddenly, no one was doing it. There were sturdy beggars wandering the land that had no one to take care of them. So Henry VIII had to start creating a system of poor laws that would take care of them. And he made something of a start of it, but it was left to his daughter to clean up the muddle that he'd made. By 1601, she had created an elaborate system of poor laws that would take care of all the poor in England. And the concept there was that each parish was responsible for its own poor. The parish got translated into town when it came to New England, and only be responsible for their own poor. So when the Connecticut colonies were set up, basically the entire system of poor laws were brought from England to Connecticut. And those poor laws stayed in existence pretty much from the 1600s up until the dissolution of welfare as we know it under President Clinton. So we have over 300 years of the same poor laws being in effect. It's pretty amazing.
It is absolutely amazing. And there's another part to this that you put in your book that I think is fascinating, which is the conditions of employment that were occurring about the time that this all became an issue back in ancient England. And that was simply that the feudal system was breaking down, and instead of farming, they went to raising sheep to produce wool and meat, which required fewer workers, which led to more layoffs. And I see, AI generated discussions of today similar to that.
It's exactly the whole history of it as it went along, and society evolved from the agricultural societies to industrial. You did have periodic layoffs and periodic periods of employment. Wars were always great for employment, and after the wars, there was tremendous unemployment. Someone had to deal with these cycles.
Now, you focused so much, obviously, on poorhouses because that was the emphasis in this book, and we'll interchangeably call them poorhouses, almshouses. They're both really in the same thing. They provided services without charge for paupers, and I love the way that you defined paupers, because I've heard that word so many times and never really stopped to think, what did that mean? And you said that they are completely without money or ability to earn a living. And then you say that there were overseers put in charge of determining who needed that support and then raising the taxes and managing the resources around it. How did they make that determination as to who needed help and who didn't?
Well, the remarkable thing in Connecticut was sort of the personal involvement of the selectmen of the town and magistrates in the town and justice of the peace all could make this kind of determination. For each class of pauper, there was a different means of dealing with them. For orphans generally would be bonded as apprentices to learn a trade. Elderly people, they oftentimes would auction off services to elderly people. The widow Brown is without means. We will auction off her care to the person who will charge the town the least for providing that service. And the selectmen oftentimes would determine that a person who was incompetent and needed to have an overseer, this would be rather like appointing a conservator today. So-and-so seems to be incapable of managing his own affairs, and therefore we will give him an overseer of his affairs to get him straightened out. Basically, it oftentimes had to do with people who drank too much or otherwise were making a mess of their lives. But it was all very personal and handled on the local level.
Now, there's a difference between an almshouse and another form of welfare that was occurring at that point called outdoor relief. Could you explain what the difference was between those?
Basically, at the beginning in Connecticut, there weren't any distinct almshouses, so that people would be aided right where they lived. If so-and-so needed a bit of cash support, needed to be able to get food or medical services, that would be provided right where he lived. There were no almshouses, there were no hospitals, there were no social services of any kind other than this. And then as the number of poor increased, they had a dual system. Those people who needed a little help where they lived, sort of like welfare today, people helped in their own homes. But people who had no homes would then move to the almshouse, which was a facility where they were provided with food, shelter, clothing, medical care. One of the interesting things is that the poor from the earliest times were entitled to all of those services, that they were entitled to receive any food that they needed, any clothing they needed, any housing they needed, and any medical care. much better than services we have nowadays.
It's unbelievable. And, they had also workhouse farms or work farms as a means for supporting these. Could you explain how that worked?
They were town farms. They were places where people went, they lived there, and they worked the farmers, just like most people were farmers in those days. This was just a extension of the agricultural system. People would move to the town farm, the alms house. The men who were capable of manual labor would work the farm. The women would do the cleaning and the cooking. And it was sort of like a large family. And the conditions there were not all that different than they were for average people, average farm people at the time. Then that varied somewhat as we got into the industrial system. The town farms still continued, but they took on something more of a workhouse mode, that people had to be employed. Anyone there had to do something. Even the elderly had to make baskets to be sold. But in some ways, the conditions in the town farms were better than the general population. In times of economic depression, the people in the town farms tended to eat better than the people in the general public. They raised their own cows, pigs, chickens. They had milk and cheese and butter and raised crops. And all of that were supplied to the poorhouse and also sold to the general public if there was a surplus.
Now, I went, thanks to your book, and saw one of the few remaining almshouses from the day. And it was in Middletown, and I went there, and I was amazed to think about the fact that we used to, at the peak, have 100 of these almshouses around Connecticut, and there's only a handful left.
If you look around the towns in Connecticut, you'll find a number of towns have a town farm road still there. Virtually every big city had really an almshouse or a workhouse, and every smaller city had a town farm. And most of those town farm properties, since they were a fairly large property close to the center of town, are now things like middle schools or town maintenance departments or golf clubs. There's one golf course that has a marvelously preserved poorhouse on it, including some of the original rooms in the original condition upstairs.
When you talk about how these were financed, one of the many fascinating parts of your book is that we spent so much money when you look at a percentage of government expenditure on people with these kinds of needy conditions. Can you talk about that for a bit?
The first people they went to were the relatives of the poor person. The relatives, if there were any relatives who had means, they would have to take care of those persons. And if they didn't, then it would devolve upon the towns to do so. In the very early days of the poorhouses, there were not many items included on a town budget. Road maintenance was one of the continuing issues, bridge repair and bridge construction, and the third largest item of the budget was care for the poor. And sometimes it was half the budget. It was one of the few things that was really mandated as an expense. Then when school budgets came in, then that took up a gigantic proportion. But until fairly recently, care for the poor was a gigantic part of all town budgets in Connecticut.
One of the other things that I find interesting is that in the early days, the poorhouses were built right in the center of town, and then the NIMBY, not in my backyard factor creeped in, and they started being pushed to the outskirts of town. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, that was the general pattern. And one of the interesting things was about the Connecticut State Hospital in Middletown. The original building there was the second poorhouse in Middletown. The building moved from where you saw it, instead of in a residential area, they moved it as far away as possible from the center of town out to the area where the Connecticut Hospital for the Insane was eventually created. Sometimes it created significant problems. For example, in Norwich, they moved the town farm as far away from anything as you could get. And in the town farm in those days, in that building, there were a number of mentally ill people housed in cells in the basement. And they had a fire. and the fire departments could not get there in time, and many of the mentally ill persons in the basement just burned to death. Which gave people a concept. Maybe we don't really want to have these things so isolated and not have people locked up in them at least.
That's a fascinating chapter because I was going to get into that in a second. The fact that there were these cells, and sometimes for the mentally ill who were considered particularly violent, they actually used chains, didn't they?
Yeah, they did. The mentally ill, until relatively recently, were treated terribly in Connecticut and everywhere. No one had any idea what to do with them, and oftentimes they wound up locked up or chained up, or sometimes just wandering loose around the town with no one particularly taking care of them at all. All these things started out, the poorhouses, the town farms, the mental institutions, started out with the best of intentions. And then they usually underestimated the need for the services. They underestimated how many mentally ill people there actually were in Connecticut. So the early mental institutions were always too small, overcrowded, and underfunded. And conditions became pretty awful over time.
One I want to focus on for just a second, 1873, when Connecticut put into effect the State Board of Charities. What was it like in the state before that and after that?
Before that, there was each individual town basically took care of their own poor, maintained their own charities. In the early days, people didn't move around very much. We didn't have highways, we didn't have railroads. It was possible to maintain a system, a town-based system. And if someone from Middletown came to Wyndham and needed the services of the town farm, we would provide those services and then bill the town the person came from to recollect the money. And so much of the early correspondence has to do with collecting these fees for providing services to other towns. But then as the industrial system came in, and that oftentimes you would have a factory closed down in one town and dozens of workers would be out looking for work, it became really hard to maintain a system that was town-based. Gradually, it became more and more the role of the state to provide the services, and the Board of Charities was created to oversee that situation. Every town farm was inspected at least every 2 years, and they reports the number of inmates, the services that they received, the improvements that were needed were published in those documents.
One of the things I wanted to also touch upon is the notion of how it seemed like there were some people, at least in some poor houses, who were taking advantage of particularly the youth and others who were able-bodied and able to work, and using them for third-party contracting and indentured servitude. It just seems to me that there was some cheap labor opportunities involved with the poorhouse system. Did you see it that way?
Well, not so much with the poorhouse system itself, but before the poorhouses, the only way of dealing with the poor was basically to contract their services out, so that any young person would be contracted out as an apprentice, and any sturdy beggar could indeed be put to work one way or another, usually as an indentured servant.
Michael, towns that had a rail line going through it tended to have more problems with beggars coming into town because they would hitch rides on the trains.
What happened at the time, industrialization and the railroads, and the fact that towns in Connecticut tended to specialize in one industry. You had, like, Wyndham was Thread City, there was Silver City, there was Clock City, there was Brass City. All of them specialized in one particular industry. And when there was a downturn for that industry, suddenly hundreds of workers would be out of work. There's no work in their town at all. These were, regular working people with families to support, and they would go on the tramp. So the term tramp comes from. They'd be tramping around the state looking for work. And right where there were railroads, they would hitch rides on the railroads and the boxcars and travel from town to town looking for work. And a lot of towns had what they called the tramp shack. associated with the town farm. It's basically just an empty building with a bunch of wooden bunks in it where tramps could stay overnight.
And in 1991, I still find it very ironic that the last poorhouse in Connecticut closed. Could you tell us where it was and what Parsonage Cottage was all about after 86 years?
The last poorhouse, last alms house in Connecticut was in Greenwich, the wealthiest town in the state. Largely because the town was wealthy, they continued to maintain a facility, actually a very, very nice facility for a number of elderly people in the town. Eventually, the nursing home system, became so substantial that there was no longer a need for the town to provide that service. But it was ironic that the last town farm for paupers was in Greenwich.
Just to quickly recap what happened at the federal level before it was changed in the 1990s, you have to go back to 1935 when President Franklin Delano Roosevelt ushered in a new way of dealing with welfare, and that was by federal funding. By 1936, 160,000 families received federal aid. But by 1969, 33 years later, that figure had ballooned to nearly 2 million families. And costs, frankly, got out of control with all those beneficiaries, and aid didn't always get distributed fairly to those who needed it the most. So 6 decades later, in 1992, President Bill Clinton pushed a reform bill through Congress, and he gave the welfare role back to the states. They were now responsible for distributing welfare to recipients, and they were closer to the persons who needed it, and so it would be more efficient, or so went the theory. Well, the states would receive block grant funds from the federal government, but would need to pony up some money on their own. Those changes also introduced, though, some other concepts. Number one, personal responsibility for assistance. The underlying theme there being that assistance should only be temporary for most recipients, and that recipients would now be required to work for their assistance, the so-called workfare program. Caps were placed on how long aid could be received. And another big problem in terms of helping people out of poverty was that those federal block grant funds, well, they were never indexed for inflation, meaning they didn't go up as fast as inflation went up. And by the time the financial crisis of 2008 hit, there was less real money to go around. Well, that crisis threw another 1 million families into poverty, and many remain there to this day. That wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. You know, for some Connecticut towns, you could look up on Google Maps and see if there's a poorhouse road in your community. That's where the poorhouse would have been located. Now, many towns renamed those roads, so it's not always effective, and you can always check with the local historical society to find out. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Michael Westerfield, former director of the Windham Housing Authority, where, for the record, Windham's poorhouse used to be located. He's also author of the book, The Road to the Poorhouse. The answer to this week's trivia question, well, the question was, what activity in an eastern Connecticut town in the early 1800s caused angry mobs to besiege a beautiful school building? Well, the answer is, it was a decision by Prudence Crandall in the 1830s to open the first school in Connecticut catering exclusively to black and brown-skinned females, which she did in the town of Canterbury. Next week on Amazing Tales CT, you're not going to believe what she and her students faced, and we'll hear the story from the curator and the site superintendent of the Prudence Crandall Museum. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe, and please stay healthy.